A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and, seeing him, he fell at his feet, and besought him, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a flow of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, If I touch even his garments, I shall be made well. And immediately the hemorrhage ceased, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned about in the crowd, and said, Who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him, except Peter and James and John the brother of James. When they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, he saw a tumult, and people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, Why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, Little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and walked, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Well, my friends, welcome to this episode of A Walk in the Word for this 13th Sunday in Ordinary Time. We pick up here in the 5th chapter of Mark's Gospel. If you remember, in our last episode, we examined Mark's account of the calming of the storm. At the tail end of the 4th chapter of Mark's Gospel, we have the account of Jesus, who, after a long day of teaching, instructs his disciples that they are to travel to the other side. That is, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is at the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, not far from his home base in Capernaum. He's believed by many to be teaching at a place known as the Cove of the Sower, or the Cove of the Parables. He instructs his disciples that they are to travel to the other side, into pagan territory. Now, in our last episode, we speculated that perhaps Jesus, exhausted from a long day of teaching, was traveling to the other side in order to get away from the crowds, to get away from the multitudes, in order to rest. But what we find out in the 5th chapter is that Jesus, upon arriving in the country of the Gerasenes, immediately following the calming of the storm, Following this dramatic exhibition of his authority and power over nature, he commanded the wind and the waves to be still, to be quiet, immediately calming the storm, immediately demonstrating his divinity, that he indeed is God. Who then is this? The disciples exclaim at the end of the gospel account. Who then is this that even wind and sea obey him? And following this dramatic demonstration of his divine power and authority, he arrives in pagan territory and he demonstrates his power over the demonic, over the spiritual realm. He encounters this demon-possessed man, this man with an unclean spirit. And we're told that this man, he lived among the tombs. He lived in a cemetery, and he was maniacal. He had to be chained down because he would do harm to himself, and presumably he was terrorizing all the inhabitants. This man, we're told later on in the account, this man was possessed not by just one demon, but by a legion of demons. Jesus asks the demon his name. If you go with me to verse 9, and Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Close quote. And so Jesus here, following the calming of the mega storm, he arrives in pagan territory in order to calm a different kind of storm, a spiritual storm, a raging storm. This man was possessed not just by one demon or evil spirit, he was possessed by a legion of demons. Think about that. A legion of demons. Jesus engages in battle against a legion of demons. Now, a Roman legion was a massive army of soldiers, numbering from 3,500 to over 5,000. Applying this to the gospel text, this legion connotes a massive number of demons. Now, this is borne out, and again, I don't want to spend too much time on this text, but we gloss over this text and pick up in today's gospel following this dramatic event of the deliverance of the Gerasene demoniac. But we're told later on in the text that the demon adjures Jesus, begs Jesus to send them from this man into this massive, this mega herd of pigs. And we're told in verse 13 that these pigs, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. And so Jesus delivers this man from demonic possession, a man possessed by a legion of demons. Jesus does battle with a legion, a massive army of demons. He does spiritual warfare. Up until this point, he's delivered several demon-possessed men and women. But this is on a different level. He does battle with a legion, an army of demons. And he's triumphant, demonstrating his power and authority over the demonic. That's significant, my friends. He does battle with nature and demonstrates his sovereignty, his power, and his authority over nature. And here in the country of the Gerasenes, in pagan country, Jesus demonstrates his power, his sovereignty, his authority over the demonic, over the evil spirits. And following this dramatic miracle, this dramatic deliverance, Jesus returns to Capernaum. We're told here in verse 21 of our gospel, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Let's stop there. And so what's being described here is the second leg of Jesus' journey. This is a round trip that is being described here. At the end of chapter 4, Jesus instructs his disciples, let us go to the other side. And they travel, they sail across the Sea of Galilee to the country of the Gerasenes, into pagan territory. And then following the deliverance of this demon-possessed or infested man, Jesus returns to the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And who is waiting for him? Well, that vast multitude that he left the night before after having taught them the entire day. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him. Now that shouldn't be surprising because Jesus, the night before, he left a massive crowd gathered there by the cove of the parables, or the cove of the sower, this natural amphitheater that Jesus used to communicate his message to the masses. They were waiting for him. And so Jesus arrives, and he was beside the sea. Then we're told in verse 22, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and besought him, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. Let's stop there. So following Jesus' arrival, he is approached immediately by this man who's named here, Jairus, whose name means enlightened or enlightened by God. And as we're going to see, Jairus is truly enlightened by God through this encounter with the divine physician, with Jesus of Nazareth. And we're told that he was one of the rulers of the synagogue. Now, what does that refer to? The rulers of the synagogue were laymen who were appointed by the elders to be the administrators or custodians of the local synagogue. These were laymen, not Pharisees nor scribes. These were laymen of significant standing who are appointed to this position, this post. And it was a prestigious post. It was a true honor to be named and appointed a ruler of the synagogue. And so this is a man presumably of significant means, because rulers of the synagogue tended to be among the wealthy. So he was prominent within the community, obviously known by all because of his standing. And this man seeks Jesus out. He goes to Jesus. He doesn't wait for Jesus to come to him. He doesn't wait for Jesus to appear in the synagogue. No, he seeks Jesus out. We're told, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, what happens? He falls at his feet. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and he besought him. In other words, he begged him. Now, this would have been a spectacle. This would have been something to behold. And in fact, when you survey Matthew's account of the healing of Jairus' daughter, in verse 18 of chapter 9, Matthew writes as follows, while he, Jesus, was thus speaking to them, meaning his disciples, he declares, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him. Behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him. In other words, pay attention to this. This is dramatic. This is significant. Behold, a ruler came before Jesus and dropped to his knees, begging him, beseeching him. So don't miss the significance of this gesture. The fact that Jairus falls to his knees, falls before Jesus. He fell at his feet and besought him, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. Now, what's going on here? Jairus, he's one of the rulers of the synagogue. Why is he imploring Jesus? Why is he begging Jesus to come to his home and to lay his hands on his daughter? Well, obviously because he has heard about Jesus. He's heard all of the rumors, all of the reports of the signs and wonders and miracles. Listen, Jairus was one of the rulers of the synagogue, presumably in Capernaum, where Jesus resided. Remember, Jesus resided for that period of 3 years, his public ministry. His headquarters was based across the street from the synagogue. I'd been there. The home of Simon Peter is a stone's throw away, literally across the street from the synagogue. And you have the ruins of the first century synagogue. Now, there's a 4th century synagogue built atop the very site of the original synagogue, dating back to the time of Christ. And across the way, we find the ruins of the home belonging to Simon Peter. And so this ruler of the synagogue would no doubt be familiar with Jesus, not just because of what he had heard, but understand that if you back up with me in the Gospel of Mark to the very first chapter, we know that Jesus, upon beginning his public ministry, he enters the synagogue in Capernaum in verse 21 of chapter 1. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. So no doubt Jairus would have been aware of Jesus, because Jesus immediately makes a significant impression upon the religious leaders and all who were gathered there at the synagogue. And to top it off, not only did they marvel at his teaching, but Jesus performs a miracle. He delivers a man possessed by an unclean spirit. Verse 23, and immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, who calls out Jesus, who identifies Jesus. He cries out, verse 24, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And so the demon identifies Jesus of Nazareth as the Holy One of God, revealing his identity publicly. What does Jesus do? He rebukes the demon. Be silent and come out of him. And he exorcises, he delivers this demon-possessed man in the synagogue. Do you not think perhaps that Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, was present in the synagogue during this service? And if he wasn't present, do you not think that he would have heard immediately of this Jesus of Nazareth who came in and stunned everyone with his authoritative teaching and preaching, and on top of that, performed this miracle, this sign, this wonder of delivering this demon-possessed man, of rebuking the demon and driving him out? Jairus would have encountered Jesus and his miraculous power from the very beginning of his public ministry there in the synagogue. On top of that, if you continue along in chapter 1, we know that following this account of what took place in the synagogue, following the deliverance of this demon-possessed man, he goes across the street to the home of Simon Peter. He heals Simon's mother-in-law. And now word has spread that there is a holy man, a healer in town. And so the townsfolk, they bring all of their sick, all of their demon-possessed, where? To the home of Simon Peter. Converting it into a what? Into a hospital. You pick up here in verse 32 of chapter 1, which declares as follows, quote, that evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered together about the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. Close quote. Do you not think that Jairus would have been aware of this? The fact that Jesus, not only did he deliver that demon-possessed man, but that all of the townsfolk, they brought their sick, their infirm, they brought their demon-possessed friends and relatives to the home of Simon Peter. And Jesus healed them. He healed the sick and the demon-possessed, demonstrating his power over disease and over the demonic. If that weren't enough, if you look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, you have the account of the healing of the paralytic. Once again, at the home of Simon Peter, these four men climb up to the roof and create a skylight for Simon Peter. They rip off a part of the roof, the thatched roof, and they lower down their friend, a paralytic, because Simon's home was jam-packed with those who had come to listen to the teachings of Christ. And Jesus healed the paralytic, not only of his infirmity, his paralysis, but also his spiritual paralysis by forgiving his sins. See, all of this took place in Capernaum. Not only did Jesus heal the sick and deliver the demon-possessed, if that weren't enough, if you go with me to chapter 3 of the Gospel of Mark, we're told that he once again enters the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he encounters a man with a withered hand. He encounters a crippled man. And he, on the Sabbath, in the synagogue, in front of all of the religious leaders, and presumably in front of Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, what does Jesus do? He heals the man with the withered hand. And thus, he incurs the ire of the religious authorities, because they perceived this to be a work, and one could not work on the Sabbath. And so they found fault with Jesus. So much so, if you go with me to verse 6, we're told the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. And so what does that tell us? This tells us that, yes, Jairus no doubt knew about Jesus. He more than likely witnessed a few of his miracles. The deliverance of this demon-possessed man at the beginning of Mark's gospel in chapter 1. And later on, we see that he returns and he heals the man with a withered hand, once again in the synagogue. So it's quite likely that Jairus would have eyewitnessed 2 miracles performed by Jesus, at the very least. He no doubt heard the reports of all of the signs and wonders. And so certainly this must have compelled him to consider Jesus, to approach Jesus, and to request of him that he would come to his home and lay hands on his daughter. See, this makes abundant sense because of all of what was taking place in and around the synagogue in Capernaum. But I raise this last point to you to just bring to your attention that this was not just a mere slam dunk case of, well, there's a healer in town. My daughter is deathly ill. Let me just call upon the healer to heal my daughter. No, you see, you have to understand that Jairus, placing ourselves in his position, he, as a ruler of the synagogue, was no doubt in close relationship with the authorities, with the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees. You see, he, as a ruler of the synagogue, he would have been part of the religious establishment, so to speak, even as an administrator, as a custodian. He would have been swimming in that particular world by association. And so when you consider the fact that after this miracle recounted here in chapter 3 of the healing of the man with the withered hand, when it says here that the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him, this, no doubt, my friends, I would submit to you, must have had a chilling effect on Jairus. It must have tempered his desire to seek Jesus out. Because if the Pharisees and the Herodians are coming together, and these were not parties that got along, but they were enemies. There was real enmity between the Pharisees and the Herodians, because the Herodians, they're not a religious party. They are of the political party of Herod. This is the super PAC, so to speak, that supported Herod, who was looked down upon and seen by most Jews as an illegitimate king. They engaged the Herodians in this conspiracy, in this plot to destroy Jesus. Now that's serious. That is what we call hardcore. And where is Jairus in the midst of all of this? Would he not have been reticent about approaching Jesus, given that Jesus is and has become such a controversial figure, knowing what he knows about the Pharisees and the Herodians and the religious authorities, that they not only frown upon Jesus and his ministry, but they are dead set against him. They want to destroy him. So understand that Jairus, this gesture of seeking Jesus out publicly, he's awaiting him, presumably. By the seashore, he approaches Jesus. As soon as he arrives, in the midst of this multitude, this throng, no doubt he was recognized by many in the crowd as the ruler of the synagogue, and he's approaching Jesus. Understand that Jairus is risking so much in order to appeal to Jesus. By inviting Jesus, as he does, this man of significant standing, what does he do? He humbles himself. He falls to his knees, begs Jesus to come to his home, to lay his hands on his daughter, that she might be made well, that she might be healed and delivered from this sickness. This would have required, on Jairus' part, tremendous humility. He was risking himself, risking his position. Just think about the fallout. Just think about what the Pharisees would have thought about hearing of the ruler of the synagogue, Jairus, approaching Jesus and asking Jesus for a miracle. He would have gotten in some serious hot water by doing such a thing. But yet, such was the desperation of a father, desperately seeking the healing of his daughter, who was at the point of death. Verse 23, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. My daughter is at the point of death. She's on her deathbed. Come now, Jesus. Come quickly. Here, Jairus is demonstrating his faith. In Matthew's account, going back to Matthew Chapter 9, verse 18, while Jesus was thus speaking to his disciples, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, watch this, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. Close quote. And so in Matthew's account, Matthew, he condenses the action. And here he presents Jairus as having come to Jesus, informing Jesus of the fact that his daughter had just died. She was already dead. And yet Jairus has faith enough in Jesus. Mind you, Jesus, up until this point, there's no record of Jesus raising anyone from the dead. No. But yet Jairus has faith enough in Jesus, according to Matthew's account, that even after his daughter had died, he still seeks Jesus out, believing that he has the power and authority to raise her from the dead. So we're talking about faith, significant faith demonstrated by the ruler of the synagogue named Jairus. So he beseeches Jesus, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death, going back to Mark's account. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Verse 24, and Jesus went with him. Jesus, here is making a house call. Jesus is responding with compassion, with mercy, with pity to the plea of this ruler of the synagogue. And he went with him. Mind you, Jesus is surrounded by a massive crowd, a great multitude. No doubt everyone is seeking after Jesus. But yet Jesus, upon encountering this man who falls to his knees and with great humility and faith beseeches Jesus to come to his home in order to heal his daughter, Jesus is no doubt moved with compassion. And we're told he went with him. Then we pick up here, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So again, the crowd is going with Jesus. They are following after Jesus as he makes his way to the home of Jairus. Verse 25, and there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years. Let's stop there. So what do we find here? We find here the insertion of another story. You see, the action stops here at this point. There's a pause. And what Mark does is he inserts another story, another healing account within this story of the healing of Jairus' daughter. This is a story within a story. You might remember several weeks ago, several episodes ago, for the 10th Sunday in Ordinary Time, we examined another similar type of account, a story sandwiched within another story. This is what biblical scholars refer to as the literary technique of bracketing, or intercalation, or insertion, or framing, or sandwiching. Let's go with that. It's a wonderful image to employ. It's helpful because what we find here is a literary sandwich, a story inserted in between another story. We begin with the account of Jairus, who approaches Jesus in verses 21 through 24 of Mark 5. Then there's a break in the action. Another story of healing is inserted here, namely the story of the woman with the issue of blood. We find this in verses 25 through 34. And then in verse 35, we return to the account of Jesus and Jairus and the healing of Jairus' daughter, which is found in verses 35 through 43. So this is a classic example of this technique of framing. You have one story that's A, that is the slice of bread, to use the sandwich metaphor. You have A, the beginning of a story. Then you have B, another story inserted there, kind of the meat of the sandwich, a departure from the narrative. And then the other slice of bread to complete the sandwich is A. So it's A, B, A. Here we've just concluded the first section of this intercalation. That is section A. Now we're delving into B. That is the story that is inserted within the story. And later on, we'll pick up in A again as the narrative concludes with the healing of Jairus' daughter. So I hope that makes sense. Here we have an example of biblical intercalation or sandwiching. This technique is employed as a means of pairing stories that complement each other. And as we're going to see, this is a prime example of this. We're going to see that this account of the woman with the issue of blood, who is in desperate need of healing, that this story pairs beautifully and complements beautifully and sheds light on the other account, namely of Jairus' daughter, who is also in desperate need of healing. So we're going to spend some time in a little while examining, comparing, and contrasting these stories, because the whole point of intercalation is that story that is inserted is going to shed light on the story in which it is enveloped, and vice versa. Okay, you're going to understand in a moment. So let's return to the text. In verse 25, we read, "And there was a woman who had had a flow of blood for 12 years." This is describing a hemorrhage, continual bleeding, presumably vaginal bleeding, a hemorrhaging, a constant flow of blood. Verse 26, "And who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I shall be made well.' And immediately the hemorrhage ceased, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?' And his disciples said to him, 'You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, "Who touched me?"' And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease.'" Close quote. Let's unpack this for a moment. Let's compare and contrast Jairus, a man of significant prominence and standing, a wealthy man, a man of significant means. He approaches Jesus with humility, falling to his knees and beseeching him, begging him for his intervention. And here we have a woman who has been plagued with this continual hemorrhage, who has spent all of her money, all of her resources on doctors and physicians, seeking a remedy for her condition. Now understand that her condition not only affected her physically, but also had spiritual implications. Why? Because when you look at the Jewish purity laws, in fact, if you go with me to the book of Leviticus, and I'll show you here in Leviticus chapter 15, verses 25 through 27, we read as follows, quote, "If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her impurity," and that's a reference to her menstrual cycle, "or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge, she shall continue in uncleanness, as in the days of her impurity. She shall be unclean." Let's stop there for a second. And so this woman with the issue of blood, with the hemorrhage of blood, this constant flow of blood, this meant that she was rendered unclean. That is, impure, perpetually impure. Let's continue in this text. Verse 26, "Every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge, shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean." Close quote. And so let's think about this for a moment. Not only did this woman suffer tremendous pain and discomfort on the physical level, but on a spiritual level, on a psychological level, on an emotional level. Just think about how devastating this must have been for her. She was considered, because of her malady, because of her affliction, because of her constant hemorrhaging of blood, she was considered to be unclean. And thus she was forbidden from partaking of the life of the community. She was forbidden from going to temple. She was forbidden from going to the synagogue, because any contact with her would render another person what? Unclean. And so she, like the lepers and others who were deemed to be unclean, she had to separate herself physically from others so as to not contaminate them. Anyone coming into contact with the woman or any of her belongings was rendered unclean themselves. So think about this, 12 years without contact with other people. 12 years of not being touched by another human being, of not being able to touch another human being. This woman was alienated, ostracized. And then remember the mentality, the mindset of the Jews back in the first century. Many of them still labored under that misconception that if one had leprosy, for example, if one was disease-ridden or blind, as in the case of the man born blind, they were convinced that he was blind either because of his sins or the sins of his parents. That there was some kind of justification that bad things happen to bad people. So just think about the fact that this woman's malady that she contracted through no fault of her own, that this malady was attributed to her immorality and unworthiness, that she was somehow being condemned or punished by God because of her sins or the sins of her parents and the like. So this woman would have suffered tremendously, not only on a physical level, but on an emotional level, a psychological level, a spiritual level, because she was cut off from the community. And this woman of low standing, no doubt a poor woman because she spent all of her money on seeking remedies for her condition. She presumably was not married because having a hemorrhage, a constant hemorrhage, would have been grounds for divorce. So if she were married, it's likely that her husband would have left her, would have filed for divorce, leaving her destitute. She spends all that she has on seeking a remedy, a solution to her problem. And what are we told here? Going back to the text, this is really heartbreaking. It says here, and there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. And so these so-called physicians, some of them no doubt quacks, were employing methods that only made matters worse, that only intensified her physical suffering. This woman, in desperation, she approaches Jesus. And she does so with great humility, with great boldness of faith. Because she determines, as we're told here, verse 27, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. You see, Jairus approaches Jesus directly, face to face. He drops to his knees in humility, but he approaches Jesus directly. This woman, this poor woman, this impoverished woman, this alienated and ostracized woman, she approaches Jesus from behind. She approaches Jesus without being detected. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Just think about the courage that it took for this woman to leave her home and to venture out in search of Jesus. Can you imagine the hope that filled the heart of this woman who was desperate, who had tried all sorts of remedies, who had been to countless doctors, spent all that she had on finding a solution? When she heard about Jesus of Nazareth, can you imagine the hope that was engendered and kindled in her? That perhaps this is the one who is able to deliver me from my affliction. And so she ventures from her home seeking Jesus, seeking an encounter with the Lord. She does not approach him directly, but from behind. She stoops down and she touches the hem of his garment. If you look at Matthew's account, once again in Matthew chapter 9, we're told here in verse 20 that this woman who suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I shall be made well. The fringe of his garment. More than likely, she reached out and touched the tassels that hung from his garment. And likely his prayer shawl, his prayer garment, which was typical of rabbis back in the first century. This garment, known as the talid, had certain tassels that were fastened to it that were reminders of the Mosaic law, the Mosaic commandments. And this woman reaches out, she touches the fringe, the hem of his garment. Presumably these tassels, which represent the law of God, the word of God, which reminded not just the rabbi, the teacher, but all those who beheld the rabbi of his devotion to the word of God, the law of God. This woman presumably reached out and touched the hem, the fringe, the tassel of his garment. No doubt this woman was concerned about contamination. She did not want to contaminate the man of God, the holy man, Jesus of Nazareth. And so she avoided direct contact with him, with his person, but she believed that if she could but touch the hem of his garment, the tassels, the fringe of his garment, that she would be healed. Such was her faith. Not wanting to contaminate Jesus, she approaches him from behind in a stealth manner, seeking to touch his garment. And immediately, we're told in verse 29, the hemorrhage ceased. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Now this provoked not just curiosity, but the disciples were absolutely baffled by this question. They're doing the crowd control. They're surrounding Jesus, presumably, in order to shield him from this multitude that is pressing in on him. And so they're wondering, what do you mean? Verse 31, and his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? Verse 32, and he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. That's so powerful, my friends. Jesus, he's surrounded by this vast multitude that is pressing in on him. Everybody wants something from him. They're crowding around him. They're in his presence. But nevertheless, it is this woman, this lowly woman, bowed down low, who actually touches him. And because of her profound faith, she receives complete and immediate healing. And Jesus perceives this. He perceives that power has gone forth from him. He perceives that someone has approached him in faith. And because of that faith, they have received healing, restoration. Power has gone forth from him. Who touched me? I want to know who touched me. I'm surrounded by a throng of people, a vast multitude, but yet there is one person here who has touched me and approached me with faith. Who is it? Who touched me? He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling. She approaches Jesus, once again, in fear and in trembling. No doubt wondering if he's angry perhaps with her because she has rendered him unclean by touching his garments. According to the Mosaic law, this would have rendered him unclean. She would have violated the law and thus rendered Jesus unclean and anyone else whom she came into contact with. But yet Jesus is not incensed. He's not angry with her, quite the opposite. Because the reality is that the woman, with her affliction, with her disease, with this hemorrhage, this quote-unquote unclean woman could not contaminate Jesus. But rather Jesus contaminated her with what? With healing. He infected her with restoration. Because Jesus cannot be corrupted. Jesus cannot be contaminated. No. He contaminates us with his love and his goodness and his grace and his mercy. And so she, fearing judgment, fearing being stoned for having touched someone deliberately, for having violated the law of God, she comes to him, we're told here, in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Told him the whole truth. Don't miss that. This woman suffered in silence for 12 long years. She had this hidden pain that she could not share with anyone, as she suffered alone and in silence. And Jesus wants to know who touched him in order to reveal the tremendous faith exhibited. He wants to understand the underlying pain. He wants her to witness, and that's precisely what she does. We're told here that she came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. Can you imagine how healing, how cathartic it was for that woman to finally, after all of these years, to unburden herself? Can you imagine the tears that were shed by this woman upon receiving this healing? On top of that, of being given the opportunity to unburden herself, to speak of her hidden pain, her silent affliction. And if that doesn't preach to you, if that doesn't resonate with you, see, each and every one of us, we have our own hidden pains, our hidden torments, our hidden affliction, our hidden suffering that no one knows about. And we feel isolated and alone and alienated. But yet Jesus, he beckons us to open our hearts and to share this pain, to remind us that we are not alone. We all have our own hidden struggles. But yet Jesus, he elevates this woman. What does the Bible say? Those who humble themselves will be exalted. And Jesus is in the process of exalting this woman who was bowed down because of her infirmity and affliction and social standing. And he's going to elevate her. Who touched me? I want to know who it is. Not to castigate them, but to bring them into the light. And what does she do? In fear and trembling, she comes before him and she tells him the whole truth. How many of us continue to be burdened? How many of us continue to suffer in silence when Jesus is beckoning us to come out of the shadows and to share the whole truth with him? We are not alone. He sees us. He recognizes what it is that we are going through, and he wants to deliver us. He wants to emancipate us. Who touched me? Who touched me? And so she tells him the whole truth. Now, mind you, this is public. They're surrounded by a throng of people, this vast multitude, and no doubt all eyes were on her. And they were in rapt attention as she described her trial, her tribulation, her 12-year-long tribulation, her constant suffering, her desperation, her plight. Can you imagine how much her testimony must have ministered to all those gathered there? All those listening to her story, they no doubt thought about their own hidden affliction, their own hidden suffering. And she was giving witness to the power of Christ to heal and to deliver. Jesus, in verse 34, we're told he said to the woman, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Let's stop there. Jesus, he responds here by addressing this woman, this anonymous woman who's not named in the gospel. Jairus is, but this woman remains anonymous. Jesus addresses her as daughter. Why? Because communion has been restored. He is describing here this communion between himself, between the Savior and this woman, this poor and destitute woman who's at the end of her rope. But she's come to the Savior and has been healed, delivered, and restored. And he addresses her as daughter. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your faith has made you well. He doesn't say, I have healed you. No, your faith has made you well. He's highlighting here for all those gathered around. He's highlighting her faith. Highlighting her faith. Remember, Jesus, with his disciples on the boat, they, back in chapter 4, had done battle with what? With the storm. And Jesus rebukes them. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? And here we have a prime example, actually two examples. In Jairus and in this woman with the issue of blood, we have two exemplars of people of faith who believe in Jesus and in his power to deliver and to heal. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. And then the action shifts again, and we go back to our primary story, that of Jairus and the healing of his daughter. So we pick up here in verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Let's stop there. And so word arrives from those of the household of Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue. Word arrives that his daughter has already succumbed, that she is in fact dead, that it's too late. And I love this comment here. Why trouble the teacher any further? Don't involve him any further. And I can't help but think, as I try to contextualize this passage, the fact that those of the household of the ruler knew full well the implications of the ruler's actions. The fact that Jairus was seeking after Jesus, seeking his help, that this would have put him in hot water. He was risking his job, his position, his standing by approaching Jesus, who was public enemy number one, according to the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious elders and leaders. And so the fact that they're saying here, well, your daughter's dead, so there's no point in troubling the teacher. Like we can still save face here. He doesn't have to come to our home because that would implicate us in a really, really bad light. And we get into hot water with the religious authorities. And so let's not trouble the teacher anymore. He doesn't have to come. What's done is done, and there's no remedy to this. So I can't help but think that there is that edge to this comment. Why trouble the teacher any further? Because they wanted to preserve Jairus's reputation and standing. But, verse 36, I love this, but ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Jairus, do not fear, only believe. There are times, my brothers and sisters, when we're going to have to ignore the naysayers. We all have them in our lives. Those naysayers, those that are constantly inducing us to give up and to not persevere, that we're wasting our time. You have those that believe that it's too late, that there's no remedy. The naysayers, Jesus deals with them in this way. He ignors them. But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear. In other words, do not be afraid. Only believe. That's a summons to faith. And perhaps this is ministering in a particular way to you as you listen to this. Perhaps you're going through a trial and a tribulation, and you have those that are appealing to you, inviting you to just throw in the towel or to give up. But yet Jesus, he beckons us, exhorts us to what? To not be afraid, but believe, to have faith, to trust in him. Do not fear, only believe. Verse 37, and he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. This is Jesus' inner circle. These same three disciples will accompany Jesus up the Mount of Transfiguration, where they will behold a glimpse of his glory. And once again on the Mount of Olives, as Jesus beckons them into the Garden of Gethsemane, where he will pray to the Father in anticipation of his passion and death on the cross. So he brings these three with him into the home of Jairus. Verse 38, when they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, he saw a tumult, a commotion, and people weeping and wailing loudly. Now, what is that describing? Well, going back to the first century, when it came to matters of death and the aftermath of the passing of a loved one, the family was required, even the poorest of families, at the very least, to hire 2 flutists and a wailer, a professional mourner that would come in and that would cry loudly. The flutist would play music indicative of the sorrow that the family was experiencing. And so this was something that was commonplace. Now, you think about someone of the standing of Jairus, a man of significant means, a wealthy man, a prominent man. And no doubt he could afford much more than just 2 flutists and a professional mourner. But no doubt he had assembled there an entire choir of professional mourners and instrumentalists who were producing a wailing, a cacophony of mourning that is described here as a tumult. I mean, just a large commotion of people mourning and wailing loudly. Verse 39, and when he had entered, he said to them, why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Verse 40, and they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were there with him and went in where the child was. Let's stop there. And so he, upon encountering this spectacle, this tumult, this chaotic commotion, these people carrying on and on, these professional mourners who are wailing, these musicians who are playing this music evocative of sadness and mourning, he confronts them, he addresses them. Why do you make a tumult and weep? Now, this would have been commonplace. This would have been expected in any home, but in particular in the home of a man of the standing of Jairus. They were pulling out all the stops. But yet he confronts them. Why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And he's mocked. These professional mourners who were trained to weep could not control their laughter. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. I mean, you see how Jesus had to ignore the members of Jairus' household who were wishing to dismiss Jesus. Why trouble the teacher any further? We have no need of him. What's done is done. She's dead. There's no remedy. There's no hope. Again, the naysayers. He ignored them and he addressed Jairus. Do not be afraid. Do not fear. Only believe. And now he has to encounter a multitude of mourners who are beside themselves, who are filled with grief and who are going through the motions and expressing their profound sorrow on behalf of the family. And what does Jesus do? Jesus addresses them. Why? Why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Why do you make a tumult and weep? Because the master is here. I have been summoned. I who have the power over the seas and the waves, power over the demonic. I have power over disease, as I've just demonstrated a moment ago with the woman with the issue of blood. And here I'm going to demonstrate that I have the power over death. So why? Why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And we're going to see this again in the account of Lazarus. Jesus, in speaking of Lazarus, he describes Lazarus as being asleep and that he's going to wake him. It's the sleep of death. These terms are used interchangeably. We pick up here in verse 40, and they laughed at him, but he put them all outside. And so he takes the parents. He's followed by his 3 disciples, his closest collaborators, Peter, James, and John, and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. He took her by the hand. And I think we can so very easily gloss over that detail. But understand this, that it was forbidden for a person to come into contact with a dead body, okay, with a corpse. Again, going back to the Old Testament, go with me to Numbers chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, which read as follows, quote, the Lord said to Moses, command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp every leper and everyone having a discharge, and everyone that is unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp, that they may not defile their camp, in the midst of which I dwell. Close quote. So notice that it speaks of those having a discharge. That would have applied to the woman with the issue of blood, whom Jesus healed, and everyone that is unclean through contact with the dead. Because if one had, in fact, touched a dead body, a corpse, that would render the person unclean. Go with me to Numbers 19 and verse 13. It states here, whoever touches a dead person, the body of any man who has died, and does not cleanse himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel. Close quote. And so Jesus here, what is he doing? Jesus, going back to the account of Jesus in the land of the Gerasenes, he encounters a pagan. He encounters a demoniac. And he exorcises that demon-possessed man, risking, mind you, he lived among the tombs. Jesus is in a cemetery with a demon-possessed man, whom he delivers by sending the demons into swine. And Jews were forbidden from coming into contact with the dead as well as with swine. And Jesus risks becoming, quote unquote, unclean or defiled by healing and delivering this demon-possessed man. Then he returns to the other side of the lake of Galilee, of Gennesaret. He encounters this woman with a hemorrhage who touches him. But no, he is not contaminated, but rather contaminates her with healing. Then here, what does Jesus do? Jesus could have just simply given a command. He didn't even have to go into the home of Jairus. But what does Jesus do? He enters into the home. He enters into her chamber, and he takes her by the hand. He touches a dead body. He touches a corpse. in order to demonstrate that the Son of Man cannot be defiled. The Son of Man cannot be contaminated. The Son of Man cannot be rendered unclean or impure, but has the power to make clean and to make pure that which is unclean and impure. Jesus takes the girl by the hand. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. In Matthew's account, Jesus addresses her as daughter. Look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 22. It states, Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. As he did with the woman with the issue of blood, Jesus addresses the little girl as daughter, reflecting the bond between Jesus and his own. If that parallel weren't enough, take a look at the next verse of our gospel. Verse 42, and immediately the girl got up and walked, for she was 12 years old. Don't miss that. You see the significance here. The parallels. There are numerous parallels between these two stories. This story within a story. These stories are meant to be compared and contrasted. And so let's just very quickly do a rundown of the various parallels within these two stories and accounts. Number one, both healings occur for women. Number two, both women were deemed unclean according to the Jewish purity laws. Number three, both are referred to with the title daughter. Number four, the healing for both is described as a saving event. Number five, faith is called for in both situations. Number six, both involve people falling before Jesus. Number seven, both involve references to 12 years. Number eight, touch, human contact with Jesus, is a central element for both accounts. Number nine, what was considered unclean did not contaminate what it touched, but was made clean by the power of Jesus. And so these are the common elements, the parallels that we find between these two stories. This is precisely why Mark, and we find this evident also in Matthew chapter 9, in his account, he has the same intercalation, this sandwiching of stories. We also find this evident in Luke chapter 8. He has also this intercalation, this sandwiching of stories. Now, we conclude with the final verse. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Close quote. And so here Jesus is deliberate about maintaining secrecy. This is known as the messianic secret. And he applies it here. Now, if you were to go back to the account of Jesus' healing of the Gerasene demoniac, after his deliverance, he wants to stay with Jesus. He wants to accompany Jesus, and Jesus forbids him from accompanying him. But rather, he declares to him in verse 19 of chapter 5, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Look at verse 20. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all men marveled. Close quote. And so in the Decapolis, which means 10 cities, these are 10 pagan cities on the other side of the Lake of Gennesaret, he authorized this former demoniac to become an evangelist and to evangelize the pagans in that area. He gave him permission to announce the good news. But here, in contrast, in Capernaum, he charged them that no one should know this, because this is a significant miracle. And his hour had not yet come. And he wanted to maintain this as a secret, that he would not be attributed with this miracle, in order to preserve the integrity of his mission, because he had so much more to accomplish yet. So he, in a very selective manner, is swearing his disciples, Jairus and his wife, to secrecy. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. And I love that detail. You see, Jesus, he performs this miracle. He raises this girl from the dead. But nevertheless, the small details are not lost on him. He knows that she's hungry. And so he indicates to the parents, to the household, please don't forget to feed her because she's hungry. The Lord knows us through and through. He knows our needs, our great needs and our small needs. And he wants to attend to us, to care for us. And he told them to give her something to eat. Now, moving on from the text, we turn to our first reading, which is a short one from the book of Wisdom. Chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, and chapter 2, verses 23 through 24. Quote, God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. For he created all things that they might exist, and the generative forces of the world are wholesome. And there is no destructive poison in them, and the dominion of Hades is not on earth, for righteousness is immortal. Let's stop there for a second. So here in this book attributed to Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, he's stating here that God is not the author of death. God did not create death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. And we can see why this passage was chosen in light of the subject matter of our gospel pericope, and the fact that Jesus came to deliver us from the power of sin and death. The text picks up in chapter 2, verses 23 and 24, which state, for God created man for incorruption and made him in the image of his own eternity. Let's stop there. For God created man for incorruption. He created him to be immortal. When you go back to the account of Genesis, it is clear that God created Adam and Eve, our first parents, and he created them to be immortal, to live forever. And it was only after they partook of the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that sin is introduced into the world. And the effects of sin, the wages of sin, St. Paul declares, is death. Death is introduced by the disobedience of our first parents. For God created man for incorruption and made him in the image of his own eternity. Verse 24, but through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his party experience it. See, the devil deliberately sought to entice Eve and Adam to disobey God, and he seduces them. This is the tactic of the enemy. The devil's envy prompted him to seduce our first parents, to induce them to sin, to break their covenant with God, to disobey God and his commands. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his party experienced it. The fact that we are sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, our first parents, we're descendants of our first parents, and we're born into a fallen world because of their sin, the original sin. And we are born in a state of original sin. We're born with a natural tendency towards evil. This is what we describe in theological terms as concupiscence, a tendency, a disordered tendency towards sin, an inclination towards sin. We are born with a fallen nature. And so in that respect, those who belong to his party experience it. Yes, we experience the reality of sin and its effects. We too will participate in the reality of death. So in that respect, in those respects, we belong to his party. But through Christ, through his passion, death, and resurrection, we, through baptism, we participate. We're immersed in the death of Christ in baptism, and we're resurrected to a new life in Christ. We receive the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and we're made children of God. No longer are we children of wrath, but we're children of the Father through Christ and through the Holy Spirit. This is the power of baptism. But what is described here in the wisdom of Solomon, yes, this is describing the reality of sin and its effects, and that God is not the author of death. He did not create death. He did not intend for us to experience death. But because we were created with free will, we, through our own free will choice, going back to our first parents and to this very day, ourselves, we choose of our own volition to engage in sinful behavior and to break faith with God. And we will no doubt suffer the consequences. But through the shed blood of Christ, through his sacrifice, through his passion, death, and resurrection, and here in the gospel, he gives us clear indications of the fact that he has come to destroy the powers of sin and death and disease, sickness, illness. This is one of the effects of the original sin committed in the Garden of Eden. There was no sickness, there was no death prior to the fall. Jesus comes and he demonstrates power over nature, power over the demonic, power over disease, and power over death. And all of these signs point to the fact that he is God. And as God, he is sovereign. And at the end of his earthly sojourn, he is going to demonstrate definitively that he has the power to conquer wholly and completely the powers of sin and death. And he does that through his passion, death, and glorious resurrection and ascension to the right hand of the Father, where he will reign forevermore. We turn now to our responsorial psalm, which is taken from Psalm 30, a psalm of thanksgiving for deliverance from disease and certain death. The response is, I will praise you, Lord, for you have rescued me. Verse 1, I will extol thee, O Lord, for thou hast drawn me up and hast not let my foes rejoice over me. Verse 3, O Lord, thou hast brought up my soul from Sheol, that is the abode of the dead, restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. Verse 4, sing praises to the Lord, O you his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. But joy comes with the morning. Verse 10, hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me, O Lord. Be thou my helper. Verse 11, thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing. Thou hast loosed my sackcloth and girded me with gladness. Verse 12, that my soul may praise thee and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to thee forever. Close quote. Beautiful psalm of thanksgiving. And what are we preparing to do this Sunday? We're preparing for the Holy Eucharist, for the celebration of thanks, of thanksgiving, for all of God's favors and blessings, and for his goodness, and for the healing that he continues to impart to us through the Holy Eucharist. I'd like to conclude this episode by citing a few brief but relevant passages from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is my custom. And I would like to quote three brief passages in succession, paragraphs 547 through 549. The Catechism begins, quote, Jesus accompanies his words with many, quote, mighty works and wonders and signs, unquote, which manifest that the kingdom is present in him and attest that he was the promised Messiah. Catechism continues in 548. The signs worked by Jesus attest that the Father has sent him. They invite belief in him. To those who turn to him in faith, he grants what they ask. So miracles strengthen faith in the one who does his Father's works. They bear witness that he is the Son of God. Then we jump to paragraph 549. By freeing some individuals from the earthly evils of hunger, injustice, illness, and death, Jesus performed messianic signs. Nevertheless, he did not come to abolish all evils here below, but to free men from the gravest slavery, sin, which thwarts them in their vocation as God's sons and causes all forms of human bondage. Close quote. And then the final paragraph that I'd like to cite for you is paragraph 26:16. With this I close. Quote, prayer to Jesus is answered by him already during his ministry through signs that anticipate the power of his death and resurrection. Jesus hears the prayer of faith expressed in words, the leper, Jairus, the Canaanite woman, the good thief, or in silence, the bearers of the paralytic, the woman with the hemorrhage who touches his clothes, the tears and ointment of the sinful woman, the urgent request of the blind men, quote, "Have mercy on us, son of David," unquote. Or, quote, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me," unquote, has been renewed in the traditional prayer to Jesus known as the Jesus Prayer. Quote, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner," unquote. Healing infirmities or forgiving sins, Jesus always responds to a prayer offered in faith. Quote, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Close quote. My friends, I couldn't think of a better note to end on than with that citation from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Jesus responds to the prayer that is made in faith. We, at every liturgy, have the opportunity to come together in the Lord's presence and to demonstrate and to exercise our faith. Because at every sacred liturgy, at every holy mass, we have the opportunity to encounter the risen Lord, to receive his body, blood, soul, and divinity. We literally touch Christ and he touches us. But I can't help but be reminded of the words of St. Augustine in preparation for this episode. As usual, I read a number of commentaries from the early church fathers. And there's something that Augustine states in his commentaries. He reflects upon this gospel pericope of the woman with the hemorrhage, with the issue of blood. He compares and contrasts the crowd with the woman. The crowd crowded about Jesus, whereas this woman, she actually touched Jesus. That got me to thinking. I mean, we gather every Sunday for the sacred liturgy, millions of Catholics. We fill churches for the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Massive crowds. We crowd about Jesus, but yet how many of us come with faith, with true devotion, with a true expectancy of faith, expecting to encounter Jesus, desirous to be made whole by him? How many of us come desiring an encounter with Christ? How many of us come and truly seek to touch and to be touched by him? It struck me, there are many of us who crowd about and around Jesus, but few of us who actually touch and are touched by Jesus. And I'm convicted by that. I'm not sharing this, pointing fingers at anyone, but primarily myself. How many opportunities have I had to encounter the risen Lord and his power and his grace, but yet I was not properly disposed. I did not have the proper disposition. And I think all of us, throughout the course of our spiritual lives, are going to experience those lapses when we attend the sacred liturgy, but we're there physically, but we're not there spiritually. We're not properly disposed and inclined to receive the grace that God offers to us. How many opportunities have we squandered, my friends? But yet the gospel reminds us that what the Lord is looking for is expectant faith. He is looking for our faith. He's thirsting for our faith, and he will reward that faith because as a loving father, he tenderly reaches out to his children. Daughter, your faith has made you well. And he looks upon each and every one of us, his beloved children, and he longs for us to reach out to him as children reach out to their parents, seeking to be lifted up, to be raised up. My friends, as we prepare for the liturgy for this 13th Sunday in Ordinary Time, I want to invite you to continue to reflect upon, to ponder the scriptures that we've explored, and to recognize in Jairus yourself, to recognize in the woman with the issue of blood, to recognize that you are that woman, doubled over in pain with a secret suffering. And Jesus wants to bring you into the light. He wants you to unburden yourself. He wants to heal you, to set you free, and to make you whole. You do not have to be ashamed, but he's beckoning you to come into the light. You are that damsel that Jesus takes by the hand and wishes to raise up and to bring back to life. See, we are represented in the gospel today, and he beckons us to imitate the faith, the perseverance, the courage of Jairus and this woman with the issue of blood, and to stop at nothing before we receive the blessing that we know God is able to deliver. My friends, we are all in need of healing, of deliverance, of restoration. And we should not delay, but we should seek every opportunity with diligence and promptitude to seek the healing that only Jesus can deliver, that only Jesus can offer us, for he wishes to make us whole. Daughter, your faith has saved you. Son, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I pray, my brothers and sisters, as we prepare for the sacred liturgy, that upon receiving not only the word that will once again be proclaimed to us, that word of life, that we, upon receiving the very body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus in Holy Communion, that we will receive that communion and understand that to be a touch from Jesus, a touch from God, a touch that can heal us, set us free, and make us whole. Don't miss that opportunity. Prepare yourself for that life-changing encounter. Well, my friends, this brings our episode to a close. As always, my fervent hope and prayer is that this podcast series has been and continues to be a source of blessing, inspiration, and spiritual nourishment for you. If it has been, praise God for that. I want to encourage you, if you're watching via our YouTube channel, be sure to hit that like button, to comment, and subscribe to the channel. By doing these things, you indicate to YouTube that there's value in this content, and they're more apt to push these videos out to more and more viewers. And that's the whole point of this channel. It exists to make Christ known. If you'd like to take a step further, if this podcast has blessed you, please consider partnering with me and making it a blessing for others. You can do so first and foremost by praying for me, by sharing the link to this episode far and wide. And if you'd like to take a step further, I want to encourage you to consider becoming a partner, becoming a supporter of this podcast. You can do so in one of two ways. You can become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Hector Molina. On that site, you'll see a number of different levels of patronage. And for as little as the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can become a patron, a supporter of this podcast. Now, if you're not in a position to sow a monthly seed, we've got you covered. You can visit buymeacoffee.com/Hector Molina. On that site, you have the ability to make a one-time gift, to buy me a cup or two or three, as many as you want, of coffee, which is symbolic of making a contribution, a small contribution. Trust me, every little bit counts, as there are fixed costs associated with producing this podcast series. Every little bit helps. Speaking of patrons and supporters and coffee buyers, I want to thank my amazing supporters for their continued encouragement, for their partnership. I wouldn't be able to do this without them. So please consider becoming a patron or consider buying me a coffee. Every little bit counts, my friends, and I appreciate your support. Well, on that note, this brings our episode to a close until we gather again next week to consider the readings for the 14th Sunday in Ordinary Time. My fervent prayer continues to be for you in the words of the Apostle Paul in Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. May the word of God continue to richly dwell in you. God love you.